So this is from Test Rails Frontend talk, which I already gave at the recent RailsConf, as you probably know. But today, I'm going to be a little bit different version, maybe a little bit shorter, since we don't have a lot of time. A few words about myself. My name is Vladimir. I'm from Moscow, Russia. Unfortunately, you cannot see right now, just a blue wall behind me. And I'm working for a company called Evil Martians. We are a consultancy helping developers and teams around the world to build better, faster, more robust software. And I'm mostly a Ruby developer with a bit of like Golang from time to time. These days, I'm a backend developer. So I'm that doesn't care about UI and all that stuff a lot. And we are developers. So we have different teams usually to build web application. When I started my IT career, I was a full stack developer. I actually was like one developer in startup for a long time. So I had to do everything from JavaScript and HTML to Ruby, PHP, and like Erlang or whatever, doesn't matter. So I was a full stack developer and I knew how to do everything. But the thing changed. And today, there is a question actually, is it possible to be full stack Ruby on Rails development and build modern, interactive, full-featured applications today in 2020s? So that's a question I would like to talk about today. And the short answer is yes, but let's see how. But first, I would like to go back in time and discuss how we did full stack development with Rails in its golden age and why that has changed. So Rails is built on top of the one core principle. It's HTML over the wire. Server is responsible for everything. It's the only source of truth, and client is just acting like a minimal layer to represent the data, even the state provided by the server. That was the core idea of the full stack Rails back in the days. And to accomplish that, we had a lot of different tools. Like we have HTML preprocessors and helpers, like a small mess in Ruby, written in Ruby, which helped us to construct HTML. I can say that was the most part to work with. Sometimes such helpers turn out into monsters, which are really hard to maintain and use and whatever. So I don't miss that part of the full stack Rails. Then we have a bit of JavaScript and actually mostly CoffeeScript because like we Ruby's want everything to be like Ruby. And of course, 10 years ago, jQuery was like a masked thing, and a small thing like jQuery UJS helped us to write less JavaScript by using remote forms and JavaScript templates, which is not so popular today, especially the latter one. What else? So we had turbolinks. Actually, like 10 years ago, even that was a default gem for Rails. No one knew how to use them properly, and well, at least in my among my like friends and dev engineers. And usually, the first thing I did when building a new Rails application is just drop turbolinks. But that was a thing even 10 years ago, and we used again preprocessors for CSS to help us like, reuse some parts, use variables, make sense, whatever. And like we didn't care a lot about the UI, so we could afford using Bootstrap for the user-facing functionality because it was easy to use for backend engineers actually for full stack engineers. So to deal with dependencies, we had multiple tools. We bundled assets into gems and like use our bundler to resolve them. And sometimes we just put minified JavaScript or CSS right in the vendor assets folder. That was the way. And finally, everything was managed by the asset pipeline framework, or its core part, Sprockets. That was the tool belt of the full stack Rails development, its front-end related part. But then things changed. JavaScript awoke, and the evolution began. First, NPM and later Yarn solved the problem of managing dependencies. ECMAScript 6, 7, whatever it is called right now, kind of made CoffeeScript useless and like unnecessary. Front-end builders like Webpack moved this task of building assets to the next level, which is not possible by Sprockets. Post-CSS made SAS again unnecessary. It's because it's more powerful, and it allowed us to write CSS with a lot of useful tooling around it. Finally, we started to use front-end frameworks, and React is most popular as of now. And of course, all of that is becoming to serve as a single-page application. And Rails only responsibility in many cases is just being an API provider. That's what the situation we're kind of in right now. So that led to the separation of engineers. Now we have at least 2 teams to ship a thing. That, in my opinion, at least, but I think most of you agree with that increased development costs, and not only in terms of like money, but in terms of time as well, because like, having 2 teams coordinating them is kind of expensive. And I'm not very happy with that. So if I build a fresh application for myself today, I would try to find a way to escape from this pattern, from this separation. I would like to be a full stack developer again. So I don't want to leave my comfort zone of Ruby on Rails. So is it possible? Of course, yes, and I already said that, and we have some examples like GitHub and Basecamp. Yeah, you might say that they're kind of old, and they just can't afford to write everything into React, probably. But what about something new? A brand new application, which is kind of just a year old, which is written with this new stack, with a new front-end stack for Rails, with new magic inside of it. And that magic is Hotwire. We're going to talk about it today. So we see the examples of HTML over the wire approach reappearing again. So it's hot as Hotwire. So let's take a look at the tools, the technologies, the approaches we have today, which we can counter to the front-end tooling, which could help us to build modern web applications without leaving our comfort zone of Ruby and Rails. So let's first put on the scales the core principles, the difference between front-end driven application and HTML first application. That's the difference. The main difference is who is responsible for rendering the final HTML, because browser only needs HTML. It doesn't care about how you deliver it. You can do it server side or client side. And I can say that one of these two is better than other. That's just 2 different approaches. And everything else, which is built on top of these 2 ideas, is what make the difference. Now, when we use a front-end framework, in most cases, we build a single-page application. Single page applications are pretty cool because they're fast, at least from the perception point of view. They like interactive, smooth, and so on and so forth. There is no page reload. That's great. And actually, we can do the same, kind of the same, with Turbo, which is a new name for Turbo links. And Turbo today consists of several parts. It's Turbo Drive. This part allows us to convert any HTML-based application into a single-page application. And it does this by like, simply intercepting navigation or form submissions, replacing full page roles with AJAX requests, and like replacing HTML body contents. And it also has a concept of cache, which makes your application look pretty fast if you go back and forth, because the previously loaded HTML is added to the page immediately without requesting. So, like I said, Turbolinks is a poor man's SPA. So that's the easiest thing, easiest way to make your HTML application look like SPA. TurboFrame is a new concept of the Hotwire. And we can say that it's just turbo links, but not for the whole page, but for the page fragment. So that brings kind of composition to your page. You can load parts differently. You can handle user interactions independently, and so on. You can lazy load parts of the page, which gives an opportunity to leverage the HTTP layer caching at must. So let's take a look at a quick example of TurboFrame. It is like just to demonstrate the power of it. So this is a simple to-do list application, which you're going to use throughout the talk, two different approach. And here we see some interaction. A user can mark an item as complete or remove it. And I want to say that this is done without any JavaScript, without anything added to the client side except from the Hotwire base library. So at the controller level, we can, we write our regular actions like update and destroy, but instead of redirecting, which we usually do in that case, we render partial in response, like just a part of HTML that has to be updated. And our HTML partial needs a small modification. We need to wrap the contents of the actual contents with a TurboFrame tag. That would activate this frames functionality, and that would make the updates work only for a specific item, and everything else is done by Turbo. It just updates the content of the stack using ID, and that's it. You don't need to write anything on the client side. That's the power of TurboFrames. It's pretty cool. So that kind of brings us closer to single page application experience in terms of re-rendering parts of the page or the whole page. But now that's a problem. JavaScript framework is not only about reloading pages or not reloading them. JavaScript frameworks bring a lot of stuff like interactivity. Everything is instant because you don't have to go to the server. Most of the actions are not related to server-side operations. We have reactivity, we're going to talk about later. We have some architecture principles that led us to write robust applications, maintainable, and so on. And what do we have for HTML over-the-wire applications? We can afford keeping a lot of JavaScript because let's imagine we are backend developers and we really don't have a deep knowledge of all that JS stuff. We don't want to keep track of it. So we have just JavaScript sprinkles, a little bit of JavaScript, like Rails UJS, which is the successor of jQuery UJS. And also we have backend friendly, I would say, frameworks, like libraries, not even frameworks, just libraries, like Stimulus. That's one of our major tools for building interactive applications, but still being HTML first. Yet another example from the same app. We have like tips for the users, like small badge, which could be added to any part of the page, and that could be closed by a user. So to close this banner, we don't need to go to the server apparently. So that's just a local interaction. So we need to add some JavaScript. Let me show you how easy it is to build such component, I would say, with Stimulus. So first, let's take a look how we built it years ago with jQuery. There are going to be some function which initialize event listener, which about our CSS or whatever we use for identifying some code like prevent default, whatever, what else, I don't know. And the biggest problem here that we have multiple event listeners to call this function, because we need to track page loads, track Turbolinks page loads, we need to track jQuery, UJS, and so on and so forth. That's actually, from my experience at least, was one of the main reasons classic Rails front-end applications had a lot of bugs with front-end, because you have to keep in memory all the possible events that could lead to DOM modifications, to HTML updates. With Stimulus, you don't care about anything at all. And everything is controlled by HTML attributes in your templates. You don't need to connect them manually. You don't need to track removal or adding of this HTML on the page. You just define the behavior in the JavaScript class, and you attach this behavior to the HTML element in your template. And that's it. Just a few lines of code, and it works always. It's stable. Independently on how do you update the HTML. And it's done by the modern APIs, which are possible today, like Mutation Observer and so on. So like under the hood, Stimulus is a pretty complex library, but you shouldn't care about it. Just use it as a tool, and that's it. So yeah, that's actually just what I said. Let's skip it. So Stimulus is kind of a way to turn a static HTML to a component, as I already said, to attach a behavior to it. But yeah, you need to write a bit of JavaScript by hand, and it's not always a few lines of code. For example, like adding a date picker or like search with autocomplete text input would require some work. And in that case, what I like about Stimulus, it plays nicely with ready-made components built with other frameworks. For example, with Vue, I had a very pleasant experience with mixing Stimulus with Vue to build interactive forms and lists of items with a very Rails way. We only needed Vue just to add some complex stuff, like I already said. And you can take a look at this example repo we specifically published. It's extracted from our private projects to see how you can use Stimulus with other frameworks and make them serve your needs instead of learning them. And more examples of Stimulus could be found by these links. So just take a look at the slides later and follow them. A lot of useful stuff and ready to use examples. So you don't need to actually write a lot of stuff. You just need to add it to your JavaScript bundle. But I said that we're gonna build HTML first applications, and I've spent the last 5 minutes talking about JavaScript. That was like a necessary evil. So let's move back to Ruby and what we can do without touching JavaScript. So reactivity. Sorry. Our next part. I define reactivity as an ability of application to react on various events, both internal and from a user, and external. And the reaction should be fast or instant. And the user don't have to initiate any events in order to like produce the reaction. I mean that some events could occur on the server, and the user should have an ability to receive these events. And when we talk about asynchronous communication, which is what I described just right now, we can resist talking about WebSockets, because that's a crucial part of this new front-end stack I'm talking about today. The whole HTML over WebSocket hype started with Phoenix Live View framework, which is Elixir. So Phoenix is an Elixir framework for building web applications, and Live View is part of it as of today. So it allows you to control the HTML from the server and update it instantly, react on events, and so on and so forth. So today we're not talking about Elixir, we're talking about Ruby. So we need to find something similar in the Ruby world. And the first project, and the most popular project as of today, which tries to accomplish a similar goal, like with totally different architecture and design, but the idea is still the same: sending HTML over WebSocket, reacting to user events, and sending them to the server by WebSockets and so on, is a project called StimulusReflex. So StimulusReflex is a bit old project. It's actually a little bit older than Live View, and the major part of it, a library called CableReady, is over 3 years old. So that's no idea, but it's getting popular. Like, it started getting popular in the recent year or two, maybe. So what is CableReady? CableReady is a library which allows you to broadcast HTML modification commands from server to browser to many clients, or to single one, like as you wish. Currently, it uses Action Cable as a transport, and what most important, it uses Markdown library to update HTML. Comparing to TurboLinks, for example, or TurboFrames, which just update the whole HTML with every request, Stimulus tries to make updates as optimal as possible. So Markdown updates only change parts. It compares to dump subtrees and update all the necessary parts. That brings you better performance. That brings you reactivity, actually. Let's take a look at the example how we can use CableReady. So the same example as before. Our items, we have a button to delete an item, and here we use CableReady in conjunction with Rails UJS. We have this remote true magic attribute, which would make hitting this button to perform the request to destroy the item. And here, we have two things. So we infer the string for the item, for the list actually, and we send an event, remove event, with a specified selector to our stream, which resulted in a message sent through Action Cable channel, and the client-side library for CableReady will take care of this message and translate it into something like this. Now, we can say that CableReady looks like good old JavaScript templates, but without JavaScript and with a declarative approach instead of imperative. But the behavior of these two things are kind of similar. CableReady has a lot of built-in operations, and it could be extensible actually. So you can do pretty much anything from the server. And the upcoming version would also help make it easier to add new operations, like specific for your application, and will make it easier to subscribe to updates, like in Hotwire, which we're going to see further. So what is about StimulusReflex? As I said, StimulusReflex is a major framework for building HTML WebSocket applications. So it uses CableReady to send HTML to clients and to update the DOM on the client side. But we also need this the other direction. We need to react to the user actions, and for that we add reflexes. So reflex, like StimulusReflex, has a kind of complex architecture. I'm not going to talk about it today the whole. I just want to show the example of the reflex class. Again, we use the same application, but now we see that the events are synchronized between different users. So we add real timeness to our list. From the client-side point of view, we do not change a lot of stuff. We just add data reflex attributes. And this looks a lot like Stimulus, and it's not a coincidence because we use StimulusReflex, and under the hood it uses stimulus controllers. But it has its own syntax, which we define event, reflex class name, and action method name. On the server side, we define a class, which is a reflex class, and define these methods. Within this method, we can do multiple things. We can use cable ready to broadcast changes to everyone. So we can send morphs, so-called morphs, just for this particular user. And for every action, we have an access to the context, to the current element dataset information. So reflexes themselves are stateless, but with every action, we have an element dataset hash storing all the current DOM element data attributes. So sending morph could be done similarly to rendering partials, for example. We use a special method, we define a target selector, and that's it. It's going to be updated on the page for this particular user. So StimulusReflex is pretty stable and major library. So I suggest taking a look at it if you want to build something with HTML first approach. And if you have some problems, you can join the community with a lot of active members, and it's very friendly. So the link to the Discord server will be at the end of the talk. And one good thing about StimulusReflex is that it works with any cable out of the box, so you don't have to worry about scaling WebSockets. And the future version of StimulusReflex coming this year aims to be transport agnostic, and with some additional features like reliable data flow, so you don't miss any updates. But that's the future. Also, what I like about StimulusReflex is that it has a lot of additional libraries in the ecosystem. There are just two of them which I found most interesting: futurism and optimism. First one allows you to lazy load parts of the HTML, something like turbo frames, but a bit better in terms of functionality. And optimism is for real-time form validations, pretty costly. And that's not the only way to build HTML WebSocket and Ruby. We have turbo streams, a couple more libraries, just to talk about them a few minutes, like a few seconds actually. So turbo streams is a very minimalistic solution. It solves the same problem as cable ready. It allows you to broadcast DOM modifications to a client, but it only has 5 actions, not 35. Good part is that it's transport agnostic. It doesn't care about how you deliver these modifications, and it doesn't require any JavaScript to start working with. So from the end user perspective, you just need to add a helper to subscribe to updates, like Turbo Stream from, and then send broadcasts to a specific channel, Turbo Streams channel. That's the whole Turbo Streams. You can read more about Hotwire and all its parts in the recent blog of myself and our Evil Martians Chronicles. So I'm not going to talk a lot about it today, since we're actually mostly out of time. And I have a lot to say. 2 more libraries for building HTML WebSocket is Motion and Live, which I suggest looking at and just following their development. They follow different approach, more like live view, but we have alternatives. That's great. The last part of the talk is not about WebSockets, but about HTML itself. If we want to write everything in HTML, how do we keep it under control? How to maintain all the templates, partials, and all that stuff? And the answer to this question is better architecture. In our case, we can actually borrow some ideas from the front-end world, or one particular idea. We can start think in components instead of templates or views or whatever. So component is something that has logical meaning, is isolated and self-contained. And let's introduce view components then. So view components aim to solve the problem of maintaining our view layer, our templates. And I'm going to talk about a particular library from GitHub, ViewComponent. Let's take a quick example of how it looks like. We have a class representing the component with some arguments, like its initial state, and some helper methods. And we have a template attached to this class. So it's like a combination of a template and a helper, but everything is isolated. And we render it as like an object in any other HTML. Pretty simple. Given that we use classes, we can use OOP stuff and whatever we want, like inheritance, and we can test them in isolation. That's one of the main benefits of using components. Components also gives us a performance boost. According to GitHub, they see it up to 10x faster rendering with component than partials. In my experience, was like 2-3 times faster. I haven't never, but I believe it could be the case. And we have preview functionality. We can use storybooks and so on. So components rules. From the organization point of view, we can keep everything together, like CSS and JS related to component could be added together in the same folder as a component. We can also add stimulus controllers, previews, and reflexes to the same folder, like enhance our stuff. It's kind of hard to do out of the box, so I built a library called ViewComponent contrib to make it a bit easier to extend and use view components, but I think eventually they're going to be part of view components. So that's a kind of a playground for new ideas. And we have a lot of other tools in this field, leveraging the same idea of components for views. You can check them out as well. What else do we have? The final stuff is CSS and post-CSS stuff we have in front-end. So CSS evolved a lot. We have CSS and JS techniques to bring isolation out of the box. And we have post-CSS to use more syntax and all that's interesting new ideas, even for older browsers. And when using HTML first approach, our natural way of writing CSS is just taking a framework, a ready-made framework, as we did with Bootstrap before. And today, I usually consider 3 candidates for building a web application for that part for UI. It's Bulma, Tailwind, and Shoe. Bulma is more like Bootstrap, but it's CSS, it's modular. It's modern. Bootstrap with mobile-first approach and so on and so forth. I've been using it together with Stimulus and Vue with framework Vueify to build, for example, this application with complex forms. Everything is interactive and kind of, in my opinion, it looks pretty good for an application written by a backend developer. Tailwind CSS is a kind of hot thing today.
Hi, Vladimir. I'm really sorry for interrupting you. We're running over to the point where there's next stuff happening. So if you don't mind wrapping this up in the next kind of seconds to a minute.
Yeah, I actually just have three more slides. Sorry.
Let's get through them. Let's get through them. Thank you.
So yeah, just like I guess like this video shows you how that's the way you do with Tailwind. Just add classes and everything is beautiful. Shoelace is a different idea. It's about web components and interactions out of the box, so you don't need to write again JavaScript. Everything is bundled within an HTML attribute, and it works great. So which one to choose depends on your needs. That's some suggestions on this slide. Final thoughts. Hopefully I cut 20 more slides so we can reach final slots. So what is Frontendless Rails way? First of all, it's HTML over the wire and HTML over WebSockets. So without WebSockets, you can't build really interactive and reactive application, but we have tools for doing this. One important thing is that component-based applications should be adapted for this style as well, the same as we see in the stack. And CSS, like, it's tricky, so we can still use frameworks for that part and not bother about it. Could it be a replacement for any application? Of course not. So there are some use cases for Frontendless way, specifically like dashboards, CRUDs, admin panels, or whatever. It highly depends on how much interaction do you have, which is local to the browser, which is not dealing with server. So it's up to you. But I can say for sure that we're just in the beginning of this new era of full stack Rails applications. So if you're not convinced to use it today, just stay tuned and follow the news. And the best way to do this is to resistance at this StimulusReflex Discord and maybe ask me some questions, but we don't have time. Sorry. Thank you.